Everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I'm here with Dale Cooke. Dale has been on many times, and Dale is a perennial favorite. So I'm really excited to have Dale on. Dale, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Darshan. It's always a pleasure to come back to your show. Regulatory attorney. I own two companies, Philly Cooke Consulting and FDA Ad Law. One, obviously, a law firm. The other one is a regulatory consulting practice. I work exclusively in the area of advertising and promotion for FDA-regulated products. The vast majority of my work is in prescription drugs and some medical device work, but I also do work with other FDA-regulated products, cosmetics, foods, those types of things.
Today, Dale, what I want to talk about, and you and I had discussed previously, was talking about podcasting. And it seems really apropos considering we're doing a podcast. But one of the things that has been popping up are more and more pharma companies and device companies are looking at ways to engage in non-traditional formats. And we're going to come back and talk about this maybe today or maybe the next time around. But there were ads in the Grammys. There were ads on sort of fashion shows, which I think are interesting new formats to engage in. But another one is podcasts. I know you're going to be leading something at DIA in a few weeks in that area. But talk to me a little bit about what are the pitfalls you've seen when you start guiding companies in the promotional review space for for podcasts.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the challenge, right? We're looking at this explosion today of content and new media that in some cases doesn't seem to fit any of the old molds for the way things used to be done. And FDA, and to be fair, the Supreme Court of the United States have taken an incredibly expansive view of the notion of labeling and what qualifies as being labeling. And following, SCOTUS's lead, FDA has viewed a tremendous amount of communications that one would not otherwise think of as falling into the rubric of being labeling as falling into that category. And that means that all of your FDA regulatory compliance requirements come in. And when you're dealing with sort of the free-flowing discussion like this one that we're having on a podcast, right, where it's a lot less controlled. I didn't send you a script in advance telling you exactly what questions to ask me and telling you exactly what my answers were going to be, then that becomes a challenge, right? So to the extent that the participation by people, and I'm, using that, very broad term there because the challenges are varied depending on the nature of the person. Is it an executive of the company who is being interviewed? Is it a spokesperson who is associated with a certain brand? Is it a physician who has worked with the company? So all of those different, categories have their own, challenges associated with them. And if then the conversation turns to an FDA regulated product and you start getting into, the discussion, either intentionally because that's what the person is on the podcast to do, or coincidentally, right? You're the CEO and founder of DarshanTalks, and I'm having you on because I want to talk to this successful podcaster. Oh, by the way, didn't you tell me that you've done some work on this particular prescription drug? Isn't that great? I think that's probably changing people's lives. Would you like to opine upon that prescription drug, right? And so like those different scenarios sort of arising, and then the question has become, well, even if I didn't start out with the intention of this becoming promotional labeling for the product, have I, through the nature of the conversation, converted it into something of that sort? And, again, because the nature of the person who's doing it could vary, it's just challenging, right? And especially, I find, and this is one of the things that we're going to be talking about at the Drug Information Association ad promo conference coming up at the end of February is, especially with executives, senior executives of companies who are used to having conversations in other settings. They might, for example, especially if they're at a smaller startup type company, they might be spending a lot of time talking with venture capitalists and raising funds and disclosing all sorts of information, which is absolutely pertinent, relevant, and in many cases required to be disclosed to somebody who's considering an investment in the company. But when you make those statements now in a different arena, those statements could be construed, and on occasion have been construed by the FDA as claims about the products that are currently under investigation, that are not yet approved. Now, all of a sudden, you're engaging in pre-approval promotion. Overall FDA enforcement way down the past few years, right? Anybody who works in this arena knows that. But we saw the letter for conversations around COVID treatments last year. We saw the letter for the interview conducted on The View with, I think it was Khloe Kardashian. It was one of the Kardashians.
Right, I think it was Khloe, and I can't keep them apart. I feel terrible about saying that, but I can't tell them apart for the most part. But I feel like Khloe does most of these.
Yes. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Khloe, but and that was clearly a very different scenario than the CEO of the company talking about a drug that was not yet approved and making. I think the FDA would not object to me describing it as wild assertions about what the clinical efficacy of the drug was. I mean, they took the extraordinary step of commenting on the specific findings that he was, touting and saying, that's not at all what was going on here. So, but in that scenario, you can absolutely understand. And, the company got into separate issues unrelated to FDA enforcement, but with the SEC and other things. But, you want companies to be able to get the word out. And I think, it's not coincidental that it was a COVID treatment. During the pandemic, especially, we have seen the interest, just broad, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, covering investigational treatments. And, the public got a lesson. I remember watching one news program where the anchor, who I always thought of as a very sophisticated, individual with, significant knowledge about how the government works. And he was floored to learn that FDA conducted their own analyses of the data that the vaccines, were, from the clinical trials. And he was like, I had no idea that FDA did all of this stuff. And it was, the public was learning in real time all of this stuff that you and I have dedicated, our lives to. And there was tremendous interest in that stuff. And some of that has changed behaviors. We saw a lot of companies in those forums, and saying things that perhaps pre-COVID FDA would not have found as acceptable.
I'm not sure they necessarily find them that acceptable right now, but we'll explore that in a few seconds. You've touched on like 100 different topics I want to get into. Sure. I kept taking notes the whole time. Let's pick. I'm going to pick on one, and then we'll go to the other. One was the fact that you talked about who comes on and speaks. That was one of the pieces, and you were like, "Is it the executive? Is it a spokesperson? Is it just a doctor?" Let's assume, for argument's sake, it is a physician who is going to come onto the podcast and talk about their experiences with a drug. Does that make it a speaker program? And the reason I ask that question is, as you and I know, but some people who are listening may not, is that speaker programs are now being targeted, or at least being closely reviewed by the OIG and the DOJ for making sure that they comply with a variety of issues, including anti-kickback issues. So from your perspective, can a podcast become a speaker program, or does a speaker program require a live presentation of individuals in that room?
Yeah. So I'm not sure that I would refer to a podcast as being part of a speaker program unless the speaker program is itself an on-demand version of a speaker program where the whole idea is, there's some sort of self-directed, physicians are able to access it on their own time and when they want to. But when I'm thinking of the prototypical podcast, I'm thinking of something more like this, where it's an established entity that is out there and that hosts people on different topics. More and more, we're seeing that, there are podcasts dedicated to life sciences topics. And so a lot of those conversations are going on there. Can it qualify as being a speaker program? Well, I would be more concerned not about it being a speaker program per se, but about it being just a paid spokesperson, right? Just that, the physician, to the extent that that physician is on the payroll in one form or another, either as an employee or as an independent contractor who has a relationship, with the company by participating in their speaker program, then that person's speech is going to be scrutinized. And we know that FDA has taken enforcement in the past for people who it's unclear whether the person thought that he or she was opining in their role as an individual practitioner, or whether they were in fact trying to, do so to benefit the company from whom they were taking, remuneration. And again, FDA takes a very expansive role of what constitutes labeling. And so if it seems to fit within that, seems to be the responsibility of ownership of the product sponsor, then you have to meet the rules. And if you don't, they're going to take enforcement.
So that's interesting, right? Because you're right. You could go down the whole, is it just are you effectively acting as a salesperson or a representative of the company and promoting a product, even though you are a clinician in this specific situation? Here's a question that comes up. And let's assume that the discussion is inconsistent with the label, but is supported by either clinical efficacy or it sort of meets the substantial evidence standard. So for anyone who's not a lawyer, I just lost you. You just lost me, and one of those two. But either way, the point I'm making is, do you believe, and I'm asking for an overall sort of perspective, if you are a pharma company, how many companies in your experience are exploring the limits of what Amarin and all of these other court cases stood for, which is the limits of free speech? And which companies are sort of going, we want to stick to the rules the way the FDA has interpreted them, and we want to stick to just the labeling? Does that question make sense?
I think so. Yeah. And I hear a lot of different questions as part of it. So first off, you have this broad First Amendment concern, right? If it's truthful, non-misleading, to what extent can FDA take enforcement, and what is the agency's appetite for taking on those sorts of broad First Amendment concerns? We have not seen the agency change its public stance of what it says about this topic. And it continues to stand behind that 2017 odd memo regarding off-label promotion. And I say odd for those of you, your viewers who are not familiar with it, go read it. And it's an odd beast. It's not
67 pages with 23 options, I believe. Is there?
And it's not clear exactly what it is, right? But it's a document setting out their views. And it's not a guidance document. It's a memo. And it's like, okay, what is the status of this thing, right? It has been published. It has never been retracted or disavowed. And so, and in public statements, it seems that FDA is still, standing behind the view that you cannot engage in off-label promotion, i.e., making claims about that are inconsistent with the product's label, with certain exceptions. Certain exceptions, really importantly, the payer guidance. The payer guidance on communications prior to approval makes clear that it is permissible under certain circumstances to engage in promotional activity for non-approved uses with a payer audience, right? That's a part of that guidance that sometimes sort of slips under the radar that people don't seem to see. The FDA is saying it's okay, right? It's okay to do that under limited circumstances. How much is FDA's appetite for taking enforcement? Well, we were talking about how much enforcement there is. There ain't much, right? So that sort of tells us something right there that, just looking at the numbers are low and have been low for several years now. But their public stance remains the same, that that's just not acceptable activity, and they will stand behind that position. But they're standing behind it less and less.
And I think that's an interesting angle. I think you're right in that the FDA overall is taking less enforcement action. It's got enough to go after outside purely prescription drugs. And I'm talking about things like COVID treatment claims and the like. You're seeing a lot of stuff in the marijuana space and the COVID treatment space and the like. I get those requests to come on the podcast all the time, and it's just like, it's not been the right fit so far, at least. But I think the interesting part is, while we say that enforcement overall in promotional compliance has been down, I'm seeing an uptick in the anti-kickback space. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we're moving away from the podcast question, which was the original sort of where we started from. But I find it fascinating that you're seeing OIG and DOJ look at those exact same conversations and go, well, what did you pay the person? And was the person being paid appropriately? So they're doing an end run around the question of, is it off-label or not, by looking at the core reason for the message, if you will. Which is always the fun sort of piece that your MLR committees should be looking at, which is this a anti-kickback issue, or is this more of an FDA issue? But do you find yourself getting pulled into that question, or do you just sort of go, that's not the question you're asking me to look at, and kind of go from there?
Yeah, I don't focus on that issue per se. So that's not a primary concern of people when they come to me. They're more concerned with FDA compliance and making sure that they're square within the box on that issue. But you always have to understand those broader contexts. And absolutely, if you're reviewing promotional materials and you're not thinking about the anti-kickback concerns, then you're doing something wrong. Somebody better be thinking about it. With regard to that other point, though, because FDA enforcement is down and has been for several years, I think we're also seeing a growth of people looking for other avenues for enforcement. And the recent case with the Better Business Bureau, the National Advertising Division, where Novartis agreed to go through this process, right? It's the Better Business Bureau, not part of the federal government, right? Not legally binding. And they agreed to withdraw certain claims from their marketing materials. The case was brought by another pharmaceutical company. I believe it was Lilly who brought it.
I thought it was Abbott. I could be wrong, but yeah, okay.
Whoever brought it. And one of the things I found fascinating there was, and didn't get nearly as much coverage, the final decision went partly in favor of Novartis, partly against Novartis. In favor of Novartis with regard to their claims as made to HCPs, that the Better Business Bureau's NAD said those were not misleading. Against Novartis with regard to some of their claims in their consumer materials, where they said those claims were misleading. However, there were another set of claims that Novartis simply stopped using before the decision was reached. And so the Better Business Bureau explicitly said, we didn't make any decision about those claims at all. Now, if you're the competitor, right, if you're the company who's bringing the case against, the company that you think is engaging in misleading speech, that's probably good enough for you. Right? Like, you don't need the Better Business Bureau to issue a decision saying that they were engaging in misleading conduct if your competitor just stops making the claims that at issue, right? If that's what you want to accomplish. And the Better Business Bureau was very explicit in several of the news stories that I read about this. The person was like, please, Pharma, come on down, right? Our stalls are open for business and we would love to see more of you, so will that become a broader avenue? Will people, take them up on that? And will we start seeing more cases? I don't know yet, but it's certainly something to keep your eye on.
But let me ask you this question. And again, we're moving away from the podcast issue, which still bothers me, but it's such an interesting question because you've got the FDA FTC memo, which specifically says that jurisdiction for this should fall under the FDA. The FDA with NAD and NAC and stuff like that you're sort of dealing with a different question that theoretically should not even fall under their ambit. So talk to me about how that worked.
Well, so I mean, let's remember what the MOU says and doesn't say, right? The Memorandum of Understanding between the FDA and the FTC came about because Congress had granted FTC authority over basically all advertising to police it for, false and misleading from a consumer protection role. And then at a later date, gave FDA authority over the advertising of prescription drugs, and then at an even later date over the advertising of restricted medical devices. And so FDA and FTC sat down and drafted this Memorandum of Understanding saying we're not ceding our authority, right? We, the FTC, are not ceding or giving away our authority over advertising of prescription drugs, but FDA will take the lead on these matters, right?
Oh, I didn't read that closely. Interesting. Okay.
So they didn't. So they never gave it up. And FTC in a lot of presentations has said, "Hey, we still have this authority, right? Like, Congress didn't change the law; they didn't take it away from us." And, if we think FDA is not exercising its authority appropriately enough, we will take action, right? So they have sort of always been out there of saying, we're not going away. Now, for the most part, of course, the two agencies, FDA and FTC, they work hand in hand, right? They're constantly talking with each other. Lots of joint enforcement actions, especially during the pandemic. We saw, the COVID enforcements, the letters coming out from both agencies, coordinating all of that enforcement. But, when the Better Business Bureau process, that purely independent one, is taken very seriously by the FTC. And FTC normally, if a company does not abide by the Better Business Bureau decision, then FTC will take action. And so in this case with Novartis, of course, Novartis agreed to abide by the decision and to withdraw those claims. So we won't see, I would assume that we won't see FTC taking any action about it. But, long term, again, what's going to happen beats me. It's absolutely something to keep your eye on, right? It's on the radar, and it's just another avenue, right? The Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act does not offer people the ability, right? You can refer the complaint to the FDA, but you can't force the FDA to take an enforcement action. By contrast, the Better Business Bureau, their business is open, and they're soliciting new customers, right?
I am determined to bring us back, by the way, to the podcast.
Okay, we have to talk about podcasting.
we are going to come back to it right now. So let me ask you this question. I sometimes see myself more as a not a breaking news type of journalist, but almost a discussing the news in a deeper format than then someone else will because they bluntly aren't as interested in it. So to me, I get to have that discussion. If that's true, and I fall under this this ambit of journalistic speech or whatever you want to call this, my question for you is: let's say tomorrow, instead of the CEO of a pharma company coming on, it's President Trump comes on and talks about this amazing new drug that can treat COVID. Now, maybe President Trump was a bad idea, mostly because he has control of the executive branch, and he's not beholden in the same way. And we're just going to leave it at that. But let's say someone high up in a different organization comes up. How do the protections work for an individual who is not necessarily a representative of the company, but is going to talk about the products of the company? Does the company have a duty to fix comments made by public officials, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, there is no duty to correct. The FDA, in its formal guidance on misinformation that's available on the internet, a lot of people, shorthand refer to it as the Wikipedia guidance, because that sort of is the classic example. They say something like an online encyclopedia with multiple people who are contributing to the content. And it's like, you mean Wikipedia, right? It's like, because that seems to be what they're talking about, right? And that what they say there and make very explicit is this is a voluntary activity. And that's, the word voluntary and, the adverb voluntarily is like used 6 times in a 7-page document or something like that, right? It's very clear that FDA does not think that you have a duty or an obligation as a product sponsor to go out and police the internet. And so to the extent that it is somebody who is talking on their own, not a representative, not a paid spokesperson, not an employee, etc., then no, there's no duty. Having said that, if it's somebody saying something that's truly, egregious, the other panel that I'm leading at DIA in a few weeks is about dealing with misinformation. And when it's, the latest TikTok sensation telling people that they should use your prescription drug as a braising fluid for cooking, meat. It wasn't a prescription drug. The real world example that I'm talking about, it was an OTC drug, but you can easily imagine, right? It's not that far-fetched to think that it could be a prescription drug next. Then I think you really want to go out there and say, hey, no, don't do this. And, that's a separate set of challenges. You don't have a legal obligation, as far as I can tell. You don't have a moral obligation, so far as I can tell, from the standpoint of, higher forces at play, but you really should. Just like as a good public citizen, you really should not let that type of misinformation, be out there.
So I'm gonna add a little bit of color to what you said, which is I agree with what you're saying, but I think the piece that you also are implying that some people who are not in the space may not understand is that it depends on, you are responsible for the channels you choose and the channels you adopt. So if you decide that Wikipedia is the channel you adopt, then you're responsible for it. So in the same way, my question would be, if they take, let's say someone comes onto my podcast, and I don't know why I'm sort of targeting myself, but I will. But let's say someone comes onto my podcast, makes a wild claim, and then the company chooses to take that podcast and put it on their Twitter channel, or chooses to move it to LinkedIn. At that point, they've adopted my channel, and that exposes them to potential risk. And then all those duties you were talking about of correcting misinformation do land up kicking in. But I'll let you sort of have the last word on that one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that changes things tremendously. And that's always, I refer to those things as just secondary uses, right? And any type of secondary use of content, and this is an area where not in the United States, but overseas, we have seen a tremendous amount of enforcement taking place, where the UK, for example, has taken a lot of enforcement against posts on LinkedIn for employees who are doing and saying things that the UK is interpreting as being inappropriate forms of marketing. And I think for people who are used to thinking exclusively about the United States, it's we don't think of LinkedIn as that type of a space, but clearly it is being viewed that way. And as I say, there's a lot of enforcement. So you always have to take into account those types of secondary uses. But if you just are looking at, the thing that's truly independent of you, that you have not touched, that you have not turned into a secondary use, you haven't pulled it off and put it into your context, then it's a moral issue, right? Then it's a question of being a good public citizen, right? And what you should do in that space. And it's a very hard challenge. This is not an easy subject.
I agree. Dale, before we go, any parting words?
We're going to continue to see an evolution in where and how people get information. And those channels need to have good information. The right answer cannot be, we are going to avoid participating in these channels because they don't fit the mold of what we used to do 50 years ago. The right answer has to be, somehow or other, we're going to get good information out to the people where they want it.
I love it.